PC revolution, the internet revolution, the mobile revolution, and now I think the AI revolution will be as impactful as those others, but it's hard to see it when you're living in the middle of it.
I completely agree with that. If anything, the comparison to the 90s and the onset of the internet, Mosaic and Netscape, definitely very, very similar to what's happening right now.
That's the challenge for us, that we feel that the capabilities of the present are going to be the capabilities of the future.
Welcome to another episode of Relearning Work, where we dive into the future of learning and work. In each episode, we bring you conversations with leaders from industry and education to challenge assumptions, propose ideas, and share learnings as we all navigate this world that is being reshaped by agentic AI. Whether you're an educator, a student, or a business executive looking to stay ahead in this rapidly changing landscape, there's something here for you. I'm your host, David Yip. In today's episode, we're honored to have Professor Sherman Young as our guest. He's Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Education and Vice President at RMIT University here in Australia, where he steers the entire student journey from enrolment to graduation for more than 91,000 students. A multimedia entrepreneur turned scholar and now a higher education change agent, Sherman has spent the last 2 decades in universities exploring how technology reshapes culture. Sherman is a sought-after voice on AI's impact on universities, delivering keynotes at Adobe's EduMAX conference and the ATN National Symposium on GenAI graduate skills and employability, where he challenged educators to embed AI fluency into every program. Last year, when many institutions were debating whether to ban AI or not, RMIT instead embraced it. Sherman's guiding belief is clear. AI will be an integral part of our future life and work, so we must teach students to use it critically and responsibly. From reimagining assessment to championing open, industry-linked learning models, Sherman is proving that higher education can be as agile and as inventive as the technology is transforming it. Welcome to the show, Sherman.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the very flattering introduction. Hopefully it was all true.
You got a very impressive background, and I'm curious, you started off as an entrepreneur. Can you give us a bit of
So it's
journey?
interesting. Back in the day, we didn't really call them entrepreneurs and startups. So essentially, a mate and I saw an opportunity for a business because it was around the time when publishing was being digitized. And we actually worked on, and this is probably way too much detail, but I'm going to go there anyway. We worked on a student newspaper at university, and we were one of the first newspapers in the country to actually move from the old linotype machines to a desktop solution for publishing. And Mike and I went, oh, there's a business in this. So we set up a computer graphics and publishing company, ended up doing a whole range of interesting digital publishing. And you know, we're talking before PageMaker 1. Like this was like way back.
Yes.
Back when when Adobe products were actually oldest products. You know, it was a long time ago. But we certainly saw that opportunity, and I sold that business and eventually started a business that started to play with CD-ROMs in the early days of the internet. But again, you know, I was probably never, shall I say, never sufficiently ambitious from a business perspective to turn that into a huge enterprise. To me, I was more interested in the tools, the capabilities, and I guess I reached the point where I remember sitting down at a client meeting, and I thought to myself, you know, this is interesting, but I don't want to be known as that design guy or that production guy. There's a whole bunch of interesting theoretical discourse around the new technologies, and I want to learn more about that and be known as that guy. So I kind of got out of it all and went and did a master's in media technology and law and did a PhD, eventually in online services regulation, and kind of reinventing myself as kind of an academic with a business background. which was not unique at the time, but certainly a little bit distinctive in my discipline anyway of media studies, where it was very heavy theory, and ended up where I was, and that kind of like initial understanding and embrace of what new technologies could do, tempered by theoretical understanding that technologies themselves don't do things, but human actors in
Mm.
in collaboration with technologies are what make the impact. I think that's kind of taken me to where I am, and hopefully we're in a place where we can make some impact because we're living in, as the Chinese say, very interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely. It is certainly super interesting at the moment, from numerous fronts, whether it's
Indeed, indeed.
technology or
Society, culture, politics, you go there.
everything.
It's very interesting.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely. Um, so that's a interesting shift, going from, I guess, business and sort of driving new ventures and at the cutting edge of technology. You mentioned PageMaker. That's a name I haven't heard in a long, long time. But it's such a transformation though, because I think when you got into media and in the 90s, and when the internet kind of took over, the internet and its disruptive power for the media industry was just unprecedented at the time. It was very quick, and it was actually quite
Well, I'm going to dispute that. It
yeah.
was, and it's that classic thing that we always, and I know Bill Gates has said or said it, but I'm sure others have said it as well. We always underestimate how long it takes for impact to happen, but
Mm,
then we always underestimate the impact when it does happen. So
yeah.
it took a long time to get from um, the early days of the text-only internet to the browser through the
Mm,
dot-com boom until
mm,
where we are now.
yeah.
It took a while before we're now at the point where you can jump on the Qantas website and book and everything in a fairly seamless way. And it's and I guess the parallels to today are, and I'm not the first one to make this observation, the Chat GPT release at the end of 2022 was probably akin to Mosaic
Yes.
back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it probably was the point where,
Mm,
despite the fact that the internet had been around through the days of ARNet, etc.,
yeah. Yeah.
and those of us who were sufficiently geeky were using Telnet and Links and
Yeah.
all of those, and FTP and Archie and all of those protocols, it was really when Mosaic kind of landed the graphic browser that
And it made it
the
accessible
rest,
to the public.
exactly, and the
Yeah.
rest of the world started to catch on. And
Mm,
GPT, what was it, 3 back in October 22, was the same thing. And
yeah.
I don't know, we're probably now around Netscape. I,
Mm,
I don't
yeah.
think I don't think we're anywhere near what the potential of AI is, which
Mm,
is why it's a really interesting time because I've lived through the PC revolution, the internet revolution, the mobile revolution,
mm,
and now I think the AI revolution will be as impactful as those others, but it's
mm,
hard to see it when you're living in the middle of it. I use the word revolution advisedly because,
mm.
I am an academic, and for all those academics who are listening, I have a much more nuanced view of how all this works. But for the purposes of this
Yeah.
conversation, when you look back
Yeah.
historically, they
Yeah.
are quite significant changes in how our social, cultural, and political landscapes have evolved, and none of that would have been possible without those technological implementation.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think if anything, the comparison to the 90s and the onset of the internet with Mosaic and Netscape is definitely very, very similar to what's happening right now. And one thing that I do want to discuss, and I discuss with all my guests, is because of this change, because of this opportunity in front of us, we have to be in the right mindset, and we have to understand some of the assumptions that's kind of creating the mindsets that we are in order to be able to see the opportunities in front of us, because it could be, depending on what mindset that we're in, it could be the good thing or a bad thing, right? So back in those days, and you have studied a lot on the interactions between technology and culture and society. How does that all fit? What do you think were the overarching, I guess, mindsets and assumptions back then, and are there any similarities to where we are right now?
Oh, look, That's a really interesting question, David. There are similarities, and you can see the different actors and the different actions playing out in very similar ways. I might start from personal reflections, and I guess if I go back to each of those four inflection points, let's call them, I was an enthusiastic early PC user. All I really wanted to do was build computer games, and I tried to teach myself 6502 machine language and all that stuff. And it was never something I actually ended up doing, but it was like there was that enthusiasm of youth. When the internet came along, I was a little bit older. I saw that it was interesting, but I couldn't, and I'll be honest, I actually didn't see where it would land. And you got to remember, when I was
Mm-hmm.
running the business, it was like 1080, full HD,
Yeah.
big screen telly, and I was surfing the web at the same time on my home
Mm,
connection. And that
mm,
future in the mid
mm,
90s to me was incomprehensible. I
mm,
didn't, I
mm,
didn't see it. I think to me, that's the challenge for us,
mm,
that we forget that the capabilities, or we feel that the capabilities of the present are
mm,
going to be the capabilities of the future. And we challenge to understand how our social, political, and cultural approaches might both need to evolve and
mm,
will evolve because of those technological possibilities.
mm,
So I think the challenge for both businesses and policymakers, because that interests
mm,
me as well, and educators,
mm,
is how might we imagine a future,
mhm,
and do we have a sufficient imagination to think what the future, from a business point of view, from what the future would need, from an educator point of view, what our graduates will require.
mm,
What are the skills that they require in that imagined future? And the example that I like to use, where, and I'm going to talk about education a little bit here, where I think education has failed, the evolution of the internet towards social media,
mm,
and the affordances that social media have enabled, and the
mm,
cultural, social milieu that has created. I think education has failed because we didn't imagine that, and
mm,
we failed to educate our students for that world.
mm,
And, if you look at the dystopian present in which
mm,
parts of this planet currently exist, I would argue it's partly our fault because we
mm.
didn't imagine how we would have to actually interact with these technological possibilities. I don't think I answered your question, but I had fun answering it.
Well, I think in a way. So I guess what you were saying is that we need to question some of be aware that we are assuming certain realities, and if we don't do that, or if we don't appreciate that we are, assuming certain realities, that we may miss opportunities.
Well, absolutely, and the AI present is a really good example of that.
Mm,
I sometimes see conversations on Blue Sky and with my colleagues, etc., where I think that they imagine that Gen AI is ChatGPT 3,
mm,
and that
mm,
things
mm,
kind of stopped there. Because
mm, mm,
you get people saying, "Oh, don't use AI because it doesn't search the web." Well, actually, it does.
mm,
And don't use AI because it doesn't show the working. Well, actually, deep research does. So
mm,
there
mm,
are
mm,
there's been a incredible evolution of abilities
mm,
in the last 18 months
mm.
that I wonder whether people have actually understood, because their understanding sits back in,
Yeah.
November 22, and it's not been something that they followed and used. And so all of the debates around, which are useful and valid and necessary debates around ethics and energy consumption, etc., we need to understand that the world continues to evolve, and the parameters of those debates continue to change, both incredible and terrifying.
Yeah. At the
And
same time.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But we need to be honest enough to
Mm,
grapple with what that future might be. And that might include, to the point of, this podcast, rethinking what work is.
mm,
It might,
mm,
I think it certainly includes rethinking what education is.
Mm,
And if we don't have those conversations, if we don't find the forums for that conversation, we
mm,
will accidentally stumble into it,
mm,
and we will find ourselves in the same situation where we have, currently an out of control social media environment.
mm,
That's my assessment, but that's
mm,
I,
mm,
I don't think it's dishonest. And we need to be deliberate, I think,
mm,
in how
mm.
we engage with the AI tools moving forward.
I think that's really important. Being very deliberate about it, and intentionally driving certain outcomes, rather than stumbling upon it. But it's hard to be deliberate when things are so changing so quickly, right? And because to be intentional, to be deliberate, you kind of have to have some kind of vision of the future that you're quite relatively certain about, that you're driving towards. Within a few months, you saw that with DeepSeek. People were, I guess, in the US, they were testifying about the fact that the US was like 5 years ahead. And then next thing you know, DeepSeek pops
Wasn't.
up
Yeah, yeah.
and they were, maybe even just months ahead, you know. So it is evolving so quickly, and that is an assumption we have to really recognize, to be able to change the mindset into one of curiosity.
Yeah, I think
And
I think that's important. I think the other, I like to use a phrase, and I don't know who said it first, so apologies, I can't attribute it. Predicting the future is easy. Getting the timing right is hard. If you
yeah,
get the timing right, you're a billionaire. If you
yeah.
get the timing wrong, you're a Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education. Um, but I think what you just alluded to is not so much the directionality,
Mm,
but the rapidity. This
mm,
stuff is going to get faster, more
mm,
accurate,
mm,
more useful,
mm, mm,
very quickly,
mm,
and it will rapidly get to the point you pop onto Claude or Gemini, and it's a good intern for you. It's a great accompanying to your work. It's someone that can
mm,
support and answer questions. And you can see a point in time where it's not just a good intern, it's a good colleague. One of the biggest newspaper publishing houses,
mm,
Fairfax, in the early
mm,
2000s,
mm.
invested huge amounts of money in printing presses.
Yeah.
And because they thought that, this internet stuff it's a passing fad. I was listening to Program or Be Programmed by Doug Rushkoff.
Mm,
Doug Rushkoff wrote a lot about Gen X and technology stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in the book, he said, "Oh, my publishers cancelled my first book on the internet because they thought the internet would be over before it would be published."
yeah.
And so there was that mindset around that, and we all know how that all turned out. And I think
Yeah.
in the AI space, there's something similar happening. There's kind of
Mm,
like, I won't call it a cult, but it feels like there's a group who
mm, mm,
understand, or think they understand the direction of the
mm,
technology, the potential of the technology,
mm,
the terrifying possibilities of the technology, and are
mm,
perhaps talking amongst themselves and thinking about how it should be used and engaged. And then there's the rest of the world
mm,
that kind of sees this interesting conversation happening off to the side,
mm.
um, perhaps blissfully unaware that it might smack them in the face in 10 years' time.
So what are the skills then? If the skills that we're teaching, or the knowledge or the subjects that we're teaching today, rapidly coming to their expiry date, what should we be teaching, and what should we be thinking about equipping this next generation with the skills that's going to be remain relevant? How are you thinking about it? How's RMIT preparing for this
Yeah,
issue?
look, I'm an old humanities academic. The second part of my life was spent in the humanities,
Mm,
and I sometimes joke to my colleagues that what we should be teaching, what every student should be getting, is a liberal arts education. And I'm only half joking. And you've used the term as well. There's enduring skills. On that ATN symposium that we ran, we actually had an employer panel, and
mm,
we asked the
mm,
employers, well, what are the skills that will actually be critical for you
mm,
for
mm,
graduates in this
mm,
day and age? And they were
mm,
listing critical thinking, curiosity, communication, collaboration, all of those enduring skills. But the enduring skills, I think, are essential as we reflect on what work might become and to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that our graduates continue to be able to find useful and productive things to do, because those applied, contemporary or perishable, however you want to call them, those skills will continue to change depending on the environment, the job context, and the rapid pace of technological innovation.
In the, I guess, conventional academic setting with universities or even vocational for that matter, the focus has always been on, as you call it, contemporary skills and knowledge, right? You would teach you how to be a data analyst
See,
because it's
see,
a
I,
data
I,
science course.
I'll push back on that. I'll say yes, but if you look at certainly in the university sector, I'll push back on that because the universities will always have a set of what they call graduate attributes, which
Mm.
are more enduring,
Mm-hmm.
and they will always at least pay lip service to the idea that their graduates don't only know the specific skills, but they
Mm.
also graduate with those graduate capabilities. That's what we need all of our graduates to do. They need to go beyond that list and
Mm.
into a mental model and abstraction of how
Mm.
things might work so that
Mm.
they
Mm.
can learn for themselves
Mm.
and
Mm.
continue to adapt and evolve. And that's an applied version of those enduring skills. You know, it's the
Mm.
enduring skill is the ability to keep learning, the curiosity, the critical
Mm. Mm.
thinking. The
Mm. Mm.
application of it is the
Mm.
ability to use different tools without having to do a different course, if you know what
Mm.
I
Mm.
mean.
Mm.
So there's some nuance in what you say. And I
Yeah.
think, and this is probably going to get me in trouble with some of my vocational education colleagues, but what university colleagues would say is the difference between a skills-based vocational education and university education is that we
Mm.
are teaching above and beyond the specific skill to
Mm. Mm.
ensure that the learner
Mm.
can continue to keep
Mm.
learning, and the skills we are teaching is at a higher order. Now,
Yeah.
my TAFE colleagues would disagree with that, and
Mm. Mm.
I don't think it's a black and white distinction. I think
Mm.
it's probably a continuum.
Mm.
But let's just say in higher ed, the emphasis is on those more enduring skills, or should
Mm-hmm.
be. In
Mm-hmm.
vocational ed, the emphasis is on specific skills, and it's not to
Yeah.
say that there's a black and white distinction between who teaches what.
Well, it's definitely not black and white. And in fact, there's a concerted effort right now to harmonize and to kind
Indeed,
of blend
indeed.
the two together, right? RMIT is probably in a really, really good place because your motto, a skilled hand, a cultivated mind. It's kind of at the nexus of these two approaches. And you're actually trialing quite a number of models as well to really what the new approach should look like as well. Can you talk to some of the approaches, how you're kind of blending these two and the approaches that you're experimenting?
I think at the moment we are quite good at pathways,
Mm.
so that students can enter through a vocational education program and then articulate into a higher education pathway. So, you know, it's
Mm.
almost step by step. My personal view is that as long as it's academically defensible,
Mm-hmm.
then we can make a case for it. And the
Mm-hmm.
AQF, the framework actually exists at a whole program level.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the components of the program are up to universities. So
Mm-hmm.
embedding vocational ed qualifications should be straightforward. We are, as you know, but others may not know, a dual sector university. So we have both vocational education and higher education. There's not many of us in Australia, you know, fewer than half a dozen.
Yeah.
And so the challenge for harmonisation is probably harder for those that don't have an embedded vocational education provider
Mm.
because they have to overcome the need for partnership, the need to build trust, and I'll say it, a culture of hierarchy where some in higher education feel that it is a more valuable educational experience than vocational
Mm.
education, which I would dispute. It is something that you do come across in conversations across the sector. So I think for dual sectors, there's a lot of opportunity. I think it'll be fascinating to see how it better equips our graduates for the next stage in their life.
And as part of that embedding, you're also embedding work experience as well, right? You're embedding the vocational and the skills and knowledge, but also intertwining work into that, the earning and learning. So it's not doing one after the other, but doing it both at the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
time.
we are. And look, we do have aspirations. You know, it would be fantastic if every student at the university had some sort of placement. Now, many of our programs require placements as part of
Yeah.
accreditation, so that work happens. Um, and many of our programs actually do have placements that aren't part of the accreditation. But, we've got, depending on who you ask, between 90 and 100,000 students globally across everything we
Mm.
do. That's a lot of placements.
Yeah.
It's a lot of relationships with employers. It's a
Mm.
lot of, dare I say it, form filling,
Yeah.
safety checks, the
Yeah.
whole quality assurance piece, which is an important part of the placement activity. My personal preference would be that, and I'll be a little bit. This is my personal view, so don't take it as RMIT view. My personal view is that universities shouldn't be providing free labour
Mm.
to
Mm.
to,
Mm.
to corporates,
Oh, absolutely agree.
and that's an awful lot of bureaucracy
Mm.
to kind of like enable at scale the sort
Mm.
of experience we would want. But we know it's worthwhile. We do have a policy where every program has some form of work integrated learning experience.
Mm.
But for those in the sector, you'll know that work integrated learning doesn't always mean a placement. It
Mm.
could
Mm.
mean a partner comes in and perhaps sets a project for a class, for example.
Mm.
It could mean a series of guest lectures. It could be a whole range of other things that aren't
Mm.
necessarily a placement. And that's all valuable and it's all fantastic. And,
Mm.
and getting that
Mm.
industry exposure in every program is important. I would have to double check whether we're 100% compliant with our own policy around
Mm.
work
Mm.
integrated learning in every program, but it
Yeah.
is the aspiration. I also have a view that a placement is more valuable. The data I've seen is that when there's been reasonable placements,
Mm.
a couple of things happen. It is actually mutual benefit for everyone.
Mm. Mm.
The industry partner gets work done that they otherwise perhaps didn't have the capacity to do.
Mm. Mm.
They get fresh thinking and fresh ideas. I know that when I ran placement programs at my former institution, not RMIT, we
Mm.
had feedback from large corporates along the lines of, I would rather employ, a dozen of your students on placement than a bunch of McKinsey's consultants because we actually get fresh thinking and fresh ideas.
Mm.
Sorry,
Mm.
colleagues
Mm.
at McKinsey's, but that's.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of truth in that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but we also know, and the data from my old institution was that one in five students who went on a placement actually ended up getting a job at
Mm.
the place where they were placed.
Mm.
So
Mm.
they
Mm.
they, they built the relationship.
Yeah.
The partner wanted it to continue, and a
Yeah.
20% kind of employment rate is pretty amazing when you think about it. So
Yeah.
so there's a lot of benefit in
Mm.
placements at scale, and I would love for it to be an aspiration for RMIT, but we are challenged by the
Yeah.
scale of the ask.
It is very much a scale problem. I think, talking to a number of universities, there's not one that doesn't want it to happen, but everyone talks about the daunting scale of this thing. Ideally, they want to provide opportunities, placement opportunities for all students, and even better if it's multiple opportunities for all students. But the current approach of thinking about placements with large companies and more sort of structure around it is just very, very difficult, very expensive to scale. So we have to think differently about what placements mean. One thing that I'm very passionate about, and you mentioned something about not providing free labor. Yet, absolutely agree. This whole approach of you know working for free doesn't do anyone any good. Least of all the employer, because the employer is not there to train people, right? The employer is there to deliver a product and service to their customers and generate a profit for their shareholders. So they want people to actually contribute to that goal. Training is just part and parcel of it, and if they can get away without training, then even better. That's not their role. The educators' role is to train people. Yeah, so that's definitely a very important problem to solve.
It is. It is. Let me throw a provocation in because we've kind of pivoted the conversation from AI to placements, and at some point in there, I did say that I'm personally finding AI as a terrific intern and a terrific assistant.
Yeah,
And this is a question for you, David. I know this is your
yeah.
podcast, but I'm not above asking your question. Is there a tension where our, let's call them industry partners, might go, I would welcome some students as interns or placements, but you know what? Gemini or ChatGPT can do the job for me easier
Mm,
and
mm.
quicker. And what do we do in that circumstance?
Really good question. And I think this is one thing that everyone's grappling with. But this goes back to something that I say all the time to all my clients and podcast guests as well in conversation is that AI is something that we have to all use it. And the more we use it, the more we kind of understand some of the nuances. And those nuances require humans to be in the loop to make it worthwhile, to ask the right questions, to use it the right way, to steer it the right way. Eventually, we might get to the point where the AIs can do most of everything for us, but we're not there yet. I don't think we're going to be there for a while for fully eliminate humans. I think humans going to be in the loop for a
I
very
know
long
I
time.
probably don't disagree with that. I think there's nuances in that. But my question is, because in some ways, when we place a student,
Mm.
they are the assistant to a human.
Yes.
What you're saying may be true, but the human will remain because
Mm,
the human in the partner, the
mm,
employee of the
mm,
partner remains.
mm,
The placement is the one that's at risk. So why
mm,
would you, and again, I'm being provocative
mm,
here,
mm,
if I'm running a business, why would
mm,
I take on a student as an intern, as a human, because I'm still
mm,
that human in the loop, if I can actually ask, my example of cleaning out my references, why would I need to employ a human to clean
mm,
out my references when
mm.
Gemini can do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Exploring that as well. But one of the early things that I've started to see is that just using your example, even using Gemini to claim references, some of these sort of more mundane tasks, if you will, right? Um, it's a task that is just has to be done,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of experienced professionals still would rather not do it if they have
Correct.
someone to do it for them. Um, so telling a student support person or entry level to say, hey, can you help me sort through this list? And you can just use ChatGPT for it, but make sure you check it, right? Because I need you to check it to make sure that it's all correct, because sometimes it still hallucinates, although it's getting much better at it. But there's to incorporate some of those human double checking elements, so that I really don't have to manage it. But importantly as well, as you start doing those tasks, what I'm finding is a lot of these tasks have ancillary, not well defined things that have to happen that humans will just know to do, right? Whereas the computer was you still need to explicitly tell it to do. Quite painful, quite clunky when you're dealing with professionals who just want to get the main outcome done.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and 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 look, I think you're probably right. The meta question is, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. How long is that going to last for before
mm,
things change even more dramatically
yeah.
in the world of work?
I think one thing that is really becoming quite clear is that um, it probably won't last too long. We're talking just a few short years. So we do have a few short years to figure out a new model to build some scale behind it for education institutions to try and change the way things are currently done and support the young workforce in a new way. Because there is a very real risk that the young people are not going to get the experience that they need to build expertise. They'll learn a lot of things, but you won't be able to practice it or gain the experience to build expertise in. And so that's a problem that we all need to get together and solve. Industry, companies themselves, they'll need to plan their pipeline of future talent. You know, experienced people, expert people will eventually, retire, and they need to plan that succession. And this is something that's going to be measured in the years, definitely not in the decades. So we have to solve that problem with urgency. Now, just moving, I guess, to in the wrap up time, and this is an education podcast, so I'm curious to find out, educators who have made a big impact in people's lives. So my final question to you is, who's a teacher that you've had in your life? Or it could be a mentor or a coach or a manager that's really made an impact, and why?
I'm going to go back a little bit to high school,
Mm,
and it's only on reflection that these names sprang to mind. So two people, Dr. Jim,
Mm-hmm.
who was my computer science teacher. And I have to confess, I probably acted up in computer science class a bit. I sat next to my mate, Dave, and Dave actually went on to become the CEO of a large corporate here in Australia. And he and I would just act up and not pay attention, and because we thought we knew everything. And this was like us learning Fortran and Pascal on VT100 terminals on a university mainframe. So it was way back in the day. But Dr. Jim was a very casual American who took it all in his stride, and I think managed to encourage, whether deliberate or not, a continuing love of technology and all things to do with computers in me. So it had quite a significant impact, I think, on my future life. And the second person was Mr. Kerno, who was my English teacher at the time. And he instilled in me a love of books and reading, which continues to this day. One of my things, and colleagues at RMIT know it, as I always ask them what they're reading. When I'm being cheeky, I kind of say never trust a senior executive who doesn't read books. But I still remember the books that we read at the time, Travels with My Aunt by Graham Greene, Merry-Go-Round in the Sea, a whole bunch of kind of, as a teenager, quite influential bits of literature. But between the two, what I think the influence on me was a little bit like that, and this is going to sound a little bit, I'm not comparing myself to Steve Jobs, but, Jobs always said that Apple was at the junction of technology and the liberal arts. And to me, that's how I kind of see where I sit and the value I can add to my workplace and, anyone else I come across is that I sit at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. I understand the value of both and the need for us to actually engage with both in order for the progress of humanity. So, I can probably trace it back on reflection to Dr. Jim and Mr. Kerno, wherever they are now, because they both encouraged and instilled a love of both of those things, which continues to this day.
Fantastic. I always love hearing these stories, and it's amazing the impact educators make, particularly early ones. In your case, high school teachers. Some of the previous guests have talked about primary school teachers even. That's why I think this education profession is so important to our societies as a whole. The last section of this podcast is more of a fun one. It's about plugs. It's an opportunity to plug anything you want. So Sherman, you can plug your company, a thing, a person, whatever it might be.
So look, I'll just give my employer, RMIT, a bit of a shout out. We are trying to do interesting things. It's a fascinating time for universities in Australia, and hopefully we're an institution that can actually test and learn a few things in a way that others may struggle to. But I also will give, and this is a micro level plug, so it's probably not relevant to most people listening, but I do have a side hustle where I run a migrant resource centre in the north part of Melbourne, supporting refugees and new migrants to become Australian residents. And we support them through, health support, aged care support, migration support, life support. And so it's a plug specifically for that organisation, Spectrum, but also broadly for those organisations who support those who don't have the privilege that we all have, particularly new migrants. And those trying to find their way to a new life because, David, I don't know your personal backstory, but mine is as a migrant. And certainly I have the view that, our countries benefit from the movement of people and the talent and compassion that diversity brings to our society. So a little bit of a micro and meta plug there.
Thank you for that.
Pleasure.
And for myself, I will plug my main business, which is Alumni. We're building a earn while you learn platform, really provide a way for students to accelerate their career pathways. And that's it for this episode of Relearning Work. Thank you, Sherman, for your insights. It was a great discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing everyone again in our next episode. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, David.